Hello, lovely people. Welcome back. It's good to have you here tonight wherever you are. I'm glad you made it. I want you to picture something before we begin. You're 14 years old. You're sitting inside a carriage that has been rolling for 3 weeks solid. Outside the window, the landscape has changed completely. The hills are different. The trees are different. The people you pass on the road speak a language you are still learning to follow. You don't know precisely where you are. No one has thought to tell you. You know only that you're getting closer, with every creak of the wheels, to the place that will be your life now. And somewhere ahead, at the end of this road, there is a man you have never met. You will sleep beside him tonight. That is not a horror story. That is, by the standards of the era, a success story. You have been chosen. Here is the thing most people never stop to consider. We talk about the battlefield. We talk about the soldiers who marched out in the morning and didn't come home. And those men deserve every word we give them. But there was another kind of dangerous posting in history, one that came with silk and ceremony and the ringing of church bells, one that we have spent centuries calling a fairy tale. Being chosen as a royal wife in the medieval and early modern world was not a stroke of fortune. It was, by almost any measure, one of the most dangerous positions a woman could occupy. Kings sent armies to war and lost them. They sent daughters to the altar and lost those too. The crown was not a shield. It was, more often than you would believe, a target. Tonight, we're going to talk about why. If this kind of storytelling is what you come here for, the history that genuinely surprises you, the stories that stay with you, I'd love it if you subscribed and left a like, and tell me in the comments tonight, where are you listening from? What time is it where you are? I love to know. Now. Let those lights go a little dimmer if you can. Let the room get quieter. Let whatever needs to wait until tomorrow, wait. We're going back together, back to the great courts of Europe, to the carriages and the candlelit halls and the women who navigated all of it. I will tell you something real about them before you sleep. It began, in many cases, before the girl in question had learned to walk. This is not an exaggeration. The formal betrothal of royal children, the legal binding of a child to a future spouse, was a routine instrument of diplomacy across medieval and early modern Europe. It was used to end wars. It was used to prevent them. It secured trade routes, shored up alliances, and extended influence across borders without spending a single coin on soldiers. A daughter was, in the language of the era, a living treaty, and like any treaty, she could be signed before the full terms were understood. Ambassadors travelled across the continent on exactly this kind of business. They arrived at foreign courts bearing gifts, bearing letters, and bearing a very specific set of questions. They needed to know the ages of the available daughters, their health, their colouring, whether they were said to be intelligent, obedient, and reportedly robust. These were not personal questions. They were professional ones. The ambassador was, in the plainest terms, an assessor. Everyone understood this. No one said so out loud. The reports these men sent home could make or break a girl's future. A favourable description, good height, clear skin, a pleasant manner, a sound education, could set negotiations in motion within weeks. An unfavourable one could end a girl's prospects entirely before she had ever left her father's house. One English ambassador writing in the early 16th century described evaluating several potential brides for his king. He noted carefully which of them had good countenances and which had nothing, in his professional estimation, to recommend them. He was not being cruel. He was being thorough. It was the job. The portrait painters came next. This is where it gets, if you'll allow me, slightly farcical. In an age before photographs, before any means of transmitting a real image across hundreds of miles, the royal portrait was the primary way a prospective bride and groom assessed each other, which meant that the artist's skill and his willingness to flatter became geopolitically significant. Hans Holbein the Younger, one of the finest painters in 16th century Europe, was dispatched by Henry VIII to paint several potential brides. His portrait of Anne of Cleves, completed around 1539, was apparently rather lovely, dignified, composed, appealing. Henry was reportedly pleased, the match was agreed, and then Anne of Cleves arrived in England. Henry's response to the real woman, as opposed to Holbein's vision of her, was not what anyone had hoped. The historical record around this is muddied by later accounts, so we tread carefully here. What we can say is that the marriage went ahead as protocol required, and it was then annulled within 6 months. Holbein, with admirable political instincts, continued to enjoy royal patronage, which, as professional survival strategies go, tells you quite a lot about what it meant to work in Tudor England. But the betrothal process was merely the opening movement. What came after the contracts were signed, the negotiation of the dowry, was where the real stakes began. A royal marriage was not simply a union of two people, it was a financial agreement between two states. And like all financial agreements, it could go catastrophically wrong. The dowry was the bride's family's contribution to the match. Cash, land, political concessions, trading rights. The specific form varied, but the principle was constant. The bride came with a price tag, agreed before the wedding. What happened if the price wasn't paid? This is the part the fairy tales leave out. When Catherine of Aragon's first husband, Arthur, Prince of Wales, died in 1502, just months after their wedding, the question of her unpaid dowry became a diplomatic crisis that dragged on for nearly a decade. Her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, and the English crown spent years in bad-tempered negotiation over who owed what to whom. Catherine herself was caught in the middle, technically a widow, technically still a princess, technically a guest in England, but with no real freedom to leave. She waited. She wrote letters home. Her household ran short of money for basic expenses. She sold some of her plate to pay her staff. She was, for several years, in a kind of limbo that had no polite name. She was 19, then 20, then 21, in a foreign country, her future entirely in the hands of two men who were still arguing. This was the system working exactly as intended. The girl was not the point. The girl was the vehicle. The contracts themselves were extraordinary documents. They specified not just the financial terms but the social arrangements. How many ladies-in-waiting the bride was permitted to bring, which of her staff could travel and which could not, what language would be spoken at court, what religion she was expected to practice. Some went further still. They addressed how often the couple was expected to share a bed. They attempted to preemptively address what would happen if the bride failed to produce children. They were, in the most precise sense possible, terms and conditions. The bride, in most cases, did not negotiate them. Her father did, or her brother, or her guardian. She was told the result, and then came the border. When a royal bride crossed from her home country into her husband's territory, she did not simply drive across a line on a map. There was a formal ceremony, sometimes called the stripping, though the word is a historian's shorthand, not a period term. Everything that connected the bride to her old life was systematically removed. Her foreign attendants, the women who had known her since childhood, who spoke her language, who understood her preferences and her fears, were sent home. All of them. A new household was assembled in their place. Women she had never met. Women who spoke the language she was still learning. Women who, in many cases, owed their loyalty to court factions whose interests were very different from hers. Her name might be changed, Latinized, translated, given a new form that sounded more appropriate to a new country. Her titles changed. Her legal identity changed. She crossed the border as one person and arrived on the other side as someone the new court had already decided she would be. There is a kind of moment described across many historical accounts, the specific details varying by era and country, where the bride stood between two groups of people. Behind her, the familiar faces, the voices she recognized, the women who had travelled with her for weeks. Ahead, the strangers, and she walked forward. She had no other option, but she walked forward. Mary Tudor, daughter of Henry VIII, later Queen of England herself, was sent to France in 1514 to marry the elderly King Louis XII. She was 18 years old. Louis was in his early 50s and not in robust health. Before she agreed to the match, she negotiated one condition. If Louis died before her, she would be free to choose her second husband herself. Louis did die, within 3 months of the wedding, in January of 1515. Mary immediately married Charles Brandon, the man she had long cared for, moving with the speed of someone who understood exactly how briefly such windows stayed open. There is something quietly extraordinary in that story. A young woman who understood the machinery of royal marriage well enough to build her own exit into the contract, and then used it the moment it cracked open. She was one of the fortunate ones, because the machinery, the negotiations, the contracts, the inspections, the portraits, the border ceremony, was, in truth, the easy part. What came after the carriage arrived, after the crowds gathered, after the bells rang and the banners flew and the official documents were signed and sealed, that was where it got genuinely dangerous. The journey itself is something people don't think about enough. We talk about the marriages, we talk about the wedding, the alliance, the political outcome. But between the signing of the contract and the arrival at the church, there was a journey. And for most royal brides in the medieval and early modern world, that journey was one of the longest and loneliest experiences of their lives. Think about what it actually meant. You were taken from your home, from your mother, from the language you thought in, and the food that tasted familiar, from the sound of the particular bells that told you the time in your own city. You were placed in a carriage, or a ship, or a litter, depending on the era and the geography, and you travelled for days, for weeks, sometimes for months. Catherine of Aragon left Spain in the spring of 1501. She was 15 years old. The voyage across the Bay of Biscay was rough. Storms delayed her crossing and drove her fleet back to port. She waited. She tried again. She finally landed at Plymouth in October, nearly 5 months after she'd set out. 5 months of travel, of seasickness, of unfamiliar faces, of watching familiar coastlines disappear behind her. She was 16 by the time she set foot on English soil. She would not see Spain again. Think about that for a moment. She left at 15. She spent the next 35 years of her life in England. Some of those years were extraordinary, many were very hard, and through all of it, through the years of marriage and grief and legal battle, the country she had come from was always somewhere across the water, somewhere she could picture, but never quite reach. Mary Queen of Scots travelled in the opposite direction. She crossed from Scotland to France when she was 5 years old. 5. She'd been Queen of Scotland since she was 6 days old. That is the kind of fact that takes a moment to settle properly. Her mother sent her to the French court in 1548, with France offering a betrothal to the young heir, Francis. Mary went. She learned to speak French so fluently that it became the language she dreamed in. She spent 13 years at the most sophisticated court in Europe. When she returned to Scotland in 1561, she was 18, and Scotland felt foreign to her. The language had changed while she was gone. The religion being practiced was not the one she remembered. The people who might have known her as a girl were older now, or gone. She arrived home a stranger in her own kingdom, and that strangeness never fully resolved itself. There is something in that a girl sent abroad so young she lost her homeland without ever meaning to, that is worth sitting with. But back to the journey itself, because the physical experience of travelling as a royal bride was quite specific, and most histories skim past it in a sentence. You are in the carriage now. Feel the weight of it. The suspension is not sophisticated. Every rut in the road moves directly through you. The cushions help in the first hour. After 4 hours, the cushions stop helping. In winter, the carriage is warm from bodies. In summer, it is airless. Outside the window, your escort moves alongside. Sometimes dozens of riders, sometimes hundreds, depending on the political significance of the occasion. You can hear them, the jangle of harness, the steady thud of hooves on packed earth, the occasional shout in a language that is not yet entirely yours. You stop at inns each evening. The rooms are better than what most travellers see are and you are a future queen, and standards are maintained. But they are not your room. They don't smell right. The woman helping you undress is not the woman who has done this since you were small. She speaks to you in the new language. You answer in careful, deliberate sentences. You try not to make mistakes. She tries not to watch you struggle. The food tastes different. Not bad, just different. The bread has another texture. The wine comes from different soil. The spices in the evening meal are not the ones you grew up smelling, and the bed, when you finally climb into it, takes a long time to become warm. You listen to the unfamiliar sounds of an unfamiliar town outside the window. You think about home. Eventually, if you're lucky, you sleep. The road goes on. One thing that gets genuinely lost in these stories is the slowness of distance in this era. A letter from a mother in Madrid to a daughter now living in Vienna might take 3 weeks to arrive, or 6. It depended on the season, the roads, the mountain passes, the couriers available, and in that gap, that patient, aching gap, anything could happen. A mother could fall ill, a sibling could die, a war could quietly begin. And the daughter, going about the ritual of a new life in her new court, would have no way of knowing. She would wake up each morning carrying news from 6 weeks ago as though it were still current, because it was the only news she had. Some of the letters these women wrote home still survive. Paper and centuries have done their work on most of them, but enough remain, and what they contain, more often than not, is not politics, it is not strategy. It is the small and heartbreaking detail. One bride wrote asking whether a particular serving woman was still well. Another asked about the dog. Another asked whether the roses in the garden at home had bloomed that summer. She had been there for the roses every year of her life. This was the first summer she would miss them. She needed to know. You read those letters and you feel the edges of something very large. She was someone's daughter. She had a garden, she remembered, and she was now on the other side of a continent, slowly becoming someone else. Anne of Austria's crossing to France in 1615 has a quality unlike almost any other. She was 14 years old, daughter of the King of Spain, travelling to marry the young Louis XIII, who was himself 14. on the day she crossed the border on a small island in the Bidassoa River between Spain and France, something had been arranged that still feels, 4 centuries later, quietly astonishing. Coming toward her in the opposite direction was Elizabeth of France, Louis's younger sister, travelling to Spain to marry Anne's brother Philip. 2 brides, 2 countries, 1 narrow river between them. They passed each other in the ceremonies of that day, essentially in transit, each heading toward the other's homeland, each carrying the weight of an alliance in her luggage. It is one of the stranger images history has left us. 2 girls crossing a river toward each other, becoming each other's replacements. They were, by the diplomatic mathematics of the era, the ideal solution to an alliance problem. By almost any other measure, they were 2 children being traded. What they shared in that brief crossing on the Bidassoa was something that needed no translation. After the border ceremony, the journey continued. The new country spread out ahead. The language became slightly less strange with each passing day, though it didn't become easy quickly. The new household, those unfamiliar women who were now supposed to be her people, travelled alongside. And at the end of all that road, always, was the man, the new life, the contract made real. The arrival was its own performance. When the carriage finally rolled through the city gates, and it was always a city, always a formal entry, always designed to be witnessed, the bride was expected to look radiant, after weeks of travel, after cold mornings and indifferent beds and meals that tasted wrong, after the motion sickness and the dust and the accumulated exhaustion of hundreds of miles. She was expected to emerge from that carriage looking exactly like what the portraits had promised. Streets were cleaned for the occasion. Banners were hung. Along the entry route, tableaux were staged. Citizens dressed as mythological figures, biblical scenes performed at intervals along the road she travelled. The crowd gathered not to see a person, but to see a symbol of alliance, of peace, of diplomatic success. They cheered. They threw flowers. She sat in the open carriage and smiled. She had most likely been practicing the smile for the last 3 days of her journey. Henry VIII couldn't wait for the official introduction with Anne of Cleves. He rode to Rochester to surprise her before the formal ceremonies, presenting himself in disguise, hoping for a romantic first encounter. She was watching a bull baiting from a window when he arrived. The encounter, by most accounts, did not produce the moment he'd imagined. She didn't recognize him. He was not in person what the court portraits had suggested either. Heavier than his earlier images, not in ceremonial dress. They were, that morning at Rochester, 2 people discovering that expectation and reality had very little to do with each other, which, as romantic beginnings go, was not ideal. The official introduction proceeded regardless. The banquet was held. The evening moved toward its inevitable conclusion. And what that evening actually held, what the first hours of a royal marriage truly meant, that is the part nobody in the diplomatic record ever described with any honesty. We have to piece it together from fragments, from letters that survived, from accounts written years later when the people involved were safely out of the story. What awaited when the carriage stopped and the ceremonies ended, and the doors of the bridal chamber finally closed? It was not what the fairy tale had promised. The bedding ceremony. Most people have never heard of it, and most people, once they hear of it, immediately understand why it got quietly dropped from the historical narrative. Here is what happened. In many royal and aristocratic courts across medieval and early modern Europe, the wedding night was not a private affair. After the banquet, after the dancing, After the toasts and the music and the formal speeches, the bride and groom were escorted to the bridal chamber by the assembled company. The guests, the courtiers, the high-ranking witnesses to the alliance, they came along. The couple was helped into bed. The curtains were sometimes partially drawn. Prayers were said over the couple. Blessings were spoken. And then, in some versions of this ceremony, the guests withdrew. In others they remained nearby within earshot, as witnesses to the consummation of the alliance. The morning after, in many courts, the sheets would be inspected. Let that land for a moment. This was not considered unusual, it was considered necessary. The marriage was a legal and diplomatic contract, and its consummation was the clause that made the contract binding. An unconsummated marriage could be annulled. An alliance built on an unconsummated marriage was legally fragile, so the evidence of consummation, or its absence, was treated as a matter of state. It was documented. It was witnessed. It was, in some courts, formally reported to the relevant parties. For the bride, who in many cases had never been alone with a man before that night, who had spent her entire young life in the company of women, whose education had been carefully arranged around the principle that her virtue was her most valuable diplomatic asset. The wedding night was a passage through a door she could not see beyond, watched by people she had known for approximately 4 days. Anne of Cleves's wedding night, in January of 1540, is one of the most frankly documented in English royal history, and not for good reasons. Henry VIII was by this point 48 years old, in declining health, with a leg ulcer that caused him considerable pain and was, by contemporary accounts, difficult to be near. Anne had arrived from Germany knowing very little about what a wedding night would involve. Her attendants, when questioned later, admitted they had not educated her on the subject. It had not seemed like their place. Henry's account of the morning after, shared with his council, was blunt and unhappy. Anne's account, shared quietly with her ladies, suggested she had no clear idea whether the marriage had been consummated at all. She had been told, apparently, that the king held her hand and kissed her good night. She had understood this to be the full extent of the proceedings. It was not. Whether through Henry's physical difficulties or Anne's genuine bewilderment or some combination of both, the marriage remained, by Henry's account, unconsummated across 4 months and multiple attempts. This was the grounds when the political alliance with Cleves became inconvenient, for the annulment. The clause in the contract had not been fulfilled. The alliance was void. What is remarkable, genuinely remarkable, is what Anne of Cleves did next. She was 34 years old when the annulment was arranged. She could have contested it. She had grounds. She could have returned to Germany in humiliation. Instead, she agreed. She accepted a generous settlement, substantial income, several properties, a place at court as the king's beloved sister. She outlived Henry VIII. She outlived 2 of his subsequent wives. She outlived most of the people who had made decisions about her life without consulting her. She died in 1557 in England in comfort, having navigated one of the most dangerous positions in Tudor England with a grace that was, and remains, quietly extraordinary. Anne of Cleves played the machinery better than almost anyone, but most women didn't get a settlement. Most women didn't get a choice. The pressure that followed the wedding night, the pressure that began the very next morning in many cases, was about one thing and one thing only: the heir, the son. The proof of fertility that would secure the alliance, validate the marriage, and give the Queen a position that was at least somewhat more stable than the one she'd occupied the day before. This pressure was not gently applied. It was written into the contract. It was embedded in the political relationship between the two states whose alliance the marriage represented. It was reinforced every time a courtier glanced at the Queen's waist and then glanced away. Every time a foreign ambassador filed a report back to his own court noting that, as yet, no pregnancy had been announced. Every time the king spent an evening in the company of someone other than his wife. A queen who fell pregnant within the first year of marriage was a successful queen. A queen who did not was a political liability with a countdown that everyone could hear, but no one mentioned out loud. And the pregnancy, if it came, carried its own dangers. Dangers that were, by the standards as what soldiers faced on actual battlefields, entirely comparable. Childbirth in the pre-modern world killed women at a rate that modern medicine has so thoroughly eliminated that it can be difficult now to grasp what it actually meant. For most women, the risk per birth was roughly 1 to 2%. That sounds manageable. But royal women were not giving birth once. They were giving birth repeatedly, 6 times, 8 times, 10 times, across a 15 to 20-year period. The compound risk of that many pregnancies, in an era before antibiotics and before any real understanding of infection, was substantial. And for queens, the risks were amplified by the very conditions that were supposed to protect them. The royal birthing chamber is worth describing in some detail. When a queen took to her chamber, the formal phrase for the weeks of confinement before birth, she withdrew into a room that had been prepared according to strict protocol. The windows were covered, tapestries hung on every wall. The idea was to create an environment of warmth and enclosure, to protect the mother and the coming child from cold air and outside influences. Every fireplace in the chamber was kept lit. The room was crowded with attendants, ladies-in-waiting, midwives, physicians waiting outside the door because male physicians were generally not permitted in the birthing chamber itself. The result was a sealed, airless, overheated room packed with people in which a woman was expected to give birth without the one thing that might actually have saved her life: fresh air and a reduced risk of infection. The irony is not subtle. The elaborate care taken to protect royal mothers was precisely the kind of care most likely to harm them. Jane Seymour is the most famous example. Henry VIII's third wife, the wife he had risked everything to marry, the woman he genuinely seemed to care for, gave birth to Edward, the long-awaited male heir, on the 12th of October 1537. Edward was healthy. The birth was considered a triumph. Henry was reported to be overcome with relief and joy. Jane Seymour died 12 days later, most likely of puerperal fever, the infection that swept through lying-in chambers with devastating efficiency in an age that did not yet understand what caused it. She was 28 years old. Henry VIII wore black for several months. He would later request to be buried beside her at Windsor, a wish that was honoured. Of all his 6 marriages, historians generally consider this the one that came closest to something he might have called love. She died 12 days after giving him what he had wanted most. Think about what that means for a moment. Not for him, for her. She had done everything right. She had given him the son. She had fulfilled the primary obligation of her position. She had secured the alliance, validated the marriage, produced the heir, and she died anyway. Not on a battlefield, not in any conflict that history would name and remember, but in a sealed room surrounded by people trying to help her in conditions designed for her protection. There is something in that, in the particular cruelty of dying of the very thing everyone was trying to prevent, that stays with me. But Jane Seymour's death, devastating as it was at least swift. What many royal women experienced was something slower, something quieter, something that the historical record tends to mention in a subordinate clause and then move past quickly. The loss. That is the word the historical record tries to avoid attaching any weight to. A queen lost a child. The records note it. They move on. The diplomats filed their reports. The alliance was reassessed. The physician was perhaps questioned. And the queen, the woman who had been carrying a child for 7 or 8 months, who had survived the birth itself only for the child not to, was expected to be ready to try again. This was not unkindness exactly. It was the logic of the system. The system had no mechanism for grief. It had a mechanism for fertility, succession, and diplomatic outcomes. Grief was a private matter, and queens, by definition, had no truly private matters. Catherine of Aragon's reproductive history is one of the most documented and most heartbreaking records of this kind of loss in English royal history. She had at least 6 pregnancies during her marriage to Henry VIII, a stillborn daughter in 1510, a son named Henry who lived 52 days and then died, another stillbirth, a daughter who was born and died within weeks, a son who was born dead, and then finally Mary, born in 1516, healthy, alive, the child who stayed. One surviving child from at least 6 pregnancies. By some accounts there were more. Each loss was recorded, each loss was assessed politically, and Catherine, who by all surviving accounts was a woman of deep faith and considerable emotional intelligence, was expected to manage each one without public display. She wrote letters, she prayed, she rose from her chamber, she resumed her duties. Henry VIII, in the early years, was reportedly tender with her through these losses. But grief, for a king with a diplomatic alliance to maintain and a succession crisis quietly building, has a different shape than grief for the woman in the chamber. His grieving had a time limit built into it. The next attempt needed to be made. Think about what that meant for Catherine. She was pregnant, roughly speaking, for much of the first decade of her marriage. She carried children she had named, children who lived 52 days, children who never drew breath, and each time she rose. She appeared at court in the correct dress. She received ambassadors. She sat beside her husband at banquets and smiled for the assembled company. The grief was not invisible. It was just required to be legible only in the appropriate places, in a letter to God, in confession. In the privacy of her own chamber late at night, after the candles had been trimmed and the ladies had gone to their beds. There is a word for that particular kind of sorrow in several languages. English, in this era, didn't particularly bother to find one. By the time Henry VIII began his pursuit of Anne Boleyn, which would eventually remove Catherine from her position entirely, Catherine had been in England for more than 20 years. She had survived a diplomatic limbo, a difficult marriage, multiple bereavements, the political hostility of court factions who resented her Spanish origins, and the growing whisper campaign about her failure to produce a male heir. She was 42 years old, and the king had found someone else. What happened next is famous. What's less discussed is how long it took and how much it cost. The process of removing Catherine of Aragon from her position as queen consumed 7 years and remade the entire religious structure of England. Henry VIII separated from the Roman Catholic Church in substantial part because the Pope would not grant him an annulment. Catherine refused to accept that annulment. She refused to acknowledge Anne Boleyn as queen. She refused to the end of her life to step aside from a position she had occupied with considerable dignity for more than 2 decades. She called herself Queen until she died. the letter she wrote in her final weeks from Kimbolton Castle, where she had been moved after years of progressively more isolated residences, still survive. The last letter, written to Henry in January of 1536, addressed him as "mine especial friend." She told him she forgave him. She asked him to be a good father to Mary. She signed it Catherine, Queen of England. She died the next day. Whether her death at Kimbolton was entirely natural is something historians continue to discuss carefully. She'd been progressively isolated, her household reduced. She'd been moved from warmer residences to colder ones. Her requests for her own physician had been delayed and obstructed. She was not treated in her final years with the care her position should have commanded. The official cause was recorded as cancer of the heart, the 16th century's phrase for what was most likely a malignant mass of some kind. The word that appears most often in the sympathetic accounts is neglect. Neglect does not require active malice. It requires only that the people with the power to help choose not to use it. She was 50 years old. Now, the court. Because the court is where the next layer of danger lived, and it is the layer that most people, when they imagine what it meant to be a queen, fail to account for entirely. You imagine perhaps that being queen meant safety, that the women around you were your companions, that your household was your refuge. In some cases, over time, this might even have been partly true. But in the early years of a queen's tenure, particularly a foreign-born queen still establishing herself, almost none of it was reliable. Your ladies-in-waiting were not chosen by you. This is the detail that changes everything. The women who dressed you each morning, who handed you your letters, who helped you undress at night, who were present in your chambers during your private hours. In most royal courts of this era, they were placed by powerful families, not selected by the queen, assigned. The great nobles of the court competed for these positions not because the work was pleasant, but because proximity to the queen meant access to information, influence, and the kind of intelligence that could be sold or deployed at the appropriate moment. A lady-in-waiting was, in the currency of the court, a very well-dressed intelligence asset. She reported what she heard. She observed what she saw. She repeated what was said in the Queen's private chambers to the people who had placed her there. This was not considered dishonourable. It was considered normal. The court ran on information, and the Queen's household was one of the richest sources of it. It meant that you, the Queen, were never entirely alone. What you said in what you imagined was a private conversation might be in someone else's report before the evening was out. Your friendships were monitored. Your correspondence in many courts was read before it left the palace. Your emotional state was filed away to be used at the appropriate moment. The Queen's chambers were not a refuge. They were a political space that happened to contain a bed. And if a powerful faction decided you were inconvenient, if the political winds shifted, if the king's attention moved elsewhere, if the right people needed you removed, the weapons available to them were extraordinarily effective. The accusation of adultery. In many European courts of this era, an accusation of adultery against a queen was not simply a personal scandal. It was treason. A queen who had taken a lover had potentially corrupted the royal succession. Any child she bore might not be the king's child. The dynasty's legitimacy was in question. This elevated what would otherwise be a domestic matter into an issue of state security. The punishment was commensurate. Anne Boleyn was accused of adultery in May of 1536. She had been queen for 3 years. She had given Henry Elizabeth, born in 1533, and had suffered several miscarriages since. The last, in January 1536, is believed to have been a stillborn son. Henry's attention had moved. There were powerful factions at court who had worked consistently to undermine her, and who recognised in this moment their opportunity. She was accused of adultery with 5 men. One of them was her own brother, George Boleyn. The charges included specific alleged dates and places. The evidence, examined by historians working centuries later, is almost universally considered to have been fabricated. The testimony that condemned her was extracted under considerable pressure from men who had strong incentives to cooperate. The trial lasted a few hours. The verdict was not in any meaningful sense in doubt. Anne Boleyn was executed on the Tower Green on the 19th of May, 1536. She was probably in her mid-30s. 11 days later, Henry VIII married Jane Seymour. The machinery moved quickly when it needed to. It is worth pausing here and noting something that is easy to miss when you look at these events through the lens of Tudor drama. Something that tends to get lost in the spectacle of the scaffold and the famous last words and the historical arguments about guilt and innocence. What happened to Anne Boleyn happened to a woman who, 3 years earlier, had been the most powerful she had ever been. She had remade English religion. She had redrawn the diplomatic map of Europe. She had done what Catherine of Aragon had failed to do. She had gotten Henry to the altar. She was, by any measure, someone who'd understood the machinery. And the machinery still took her. Poison is where it gets complicated. The accusation of poisoning is a recurring feature of European court history, and it follows a consistent pattern. When a powerful person died unexpectedly, or when a queen seemed to be declining in ways that couldn't be attributed to obvious causes, the word circulated. Not always in writing, not always in the official record, but it circulated. And like all rumours in a court environment, once it was moving, it was almost impossible to stop. Catherine de' Medici, Queen Consort and then Regent of France through the second half of the 16th century, is the most famous example of a queen whose historical reputation was built almost entirely on this accusation. She was described in the pamphlets of her era and in the histories written in the century after her death as a poisoner. The Black Queen, the Italian woman who had brought dark arts to the French court. There were stories of poisoned gloves, poisoned perfumes, a cabinet of secret formulations she reportedly kept locked away. Historians working with the actual evidence have found almost no support for any of it. What they have found, instead, is a woman who wielded political power in a deeply hostile environment, a foreign-born queen in a French court that resented Italian influence, a regent governing in the names of her young sons, a woman making consequential decisions during one of the most violent periods of French history. The poisoning stories in this light look less like history and more like the specific kind of slander that courts directed at powerful women when they couldn't attack them for anything real. The Black Queen was, in all likelihood, simply a queen, a very capable one, which in the opinion of the men around her was almost as uncomfortable. But the poison stories served a purpose beyond individual reputation. They were the court's way of marking what it considered acceptable power and unacceptable power. A queen who operated within her permitted boundaries was tolerated. A queen who governed, who built political networks of her own, who made decisions that affected outcomes. She became, in the court's imagination, something threatening, something that needed a dark explanation. The poison story provided one. It gave the court a language for female political capability that didn't require acknowledging it as legitimate. The rumours didn't need to be true to be effective. They needed only to circulate. Reputation, in a court environment, What kind of currency? And a queen whose reputation was damaged was a queen whose allies became cautious, whose enemies became bolder, whose position became measurably weaker. You didn't need actual poison to destroy a queen. You needed a story that people would repeat, and stories, in courts, always found willing mouths. There is something in all of this, in the bedding ceremony and the sealed birthing chamber and the ladies who reported back to powerful families and the adultery accusations and the poison stories, that points toward a single underlying truth. The queen was the most visible woman in the kingdom. She was also, structurally, one of the least protected. Every system that appeared to surround her with care was, on closer inspection, a system designed to monitor and control her. The court's attention was not the same thing as the court's loyalty. But perhaps the most revealing thing about royal marriage, the detail that tells you more than any single story, is what happened when it ended. Not in death, not on the scaffold, but simply when the marriage was no longer politically useful, when the queen was done. The options, when that moment came, were few, and none of them were particularly good. Annulment was the cleanest solution, and it was used more often than people tend to realize. The medieval church maintained a system for ending marriages on grounds of consanguinity, the technical term for being too closely related to your spouse by blood or by a previous marital connection. The precise definitions of what counted as too closely related shifted across the centuries with remarkable flexibility, which should tell you something about the system's priorities. Eleanor of Aquitaine had her first marriage annulled on grounds of consanguinity in 1152. She'd been Queen of France for 15 years. She had travelled on crusade with her husband Louis VII. She'd been one of the dominant personalities of her generation. When the marriage became politically inconvenient and it was clear no male heir was coming, the church found the necessary degree of relationship that made the annulment technically valid. Eleanor was free within weeks. Within 2 months she'd married Henry of Anjou, who would become Henry II of England. The speed of that remarriage suggests she'd been planning it for some time, which, as career moves go, was impressively well timed. Eleanor's case was unusual because she emerged from the annulment with her lands and her political agency largely intact. Most queens were not so lucky. For many, the alternative to annulment was the convent, not always by choice. The convent, in the logic of the court, was an elegant solution to an inconvenient woman. It was not banishment. She remained technically within the category of the honourable, dedicated to God rather than disgraced. It was not imprisonment, or at least it was not called that. She would be provided for. She would be safe. She would simply be, from the court's perspective, gone. Joanna of Castile, known to history as Juana la Loca, Joan the Mad, is one of the most disturbing examples of what a court could do with an inconvenient queen when it needed her contained. She was the daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. She was the heir to the combined crowns of Castile and Aragon. She was, by every legal and dynastic measure, the rightful ruler of Spain. She was also a woman, and one who showed signs of emotional instability that the court recognized as useful. Her husband Philip of Burgundy died young, in 1506, plunging her into a grief that the court chose to interpret as madness. Her father Ferdinand, assessing the situation, had her confined. Her son Charles, the future Holy Roman Emperor, kept her confined when he came of age. She remained effectively imprisoned for 47 years in the castle of Tordesillas, until she died in 1555. She was 75 years old. She was, during that entire period, legally still Queen of Castile. The title was never taken from her. The power it represented was simply exercised by the men around her on the grounds that she was unable to exercise it herself. Whether she was genuinely unable is something that is now very difficult to assess. She'd been isolated and controlled for nearly 5 decades. What the grief of 1506 might have become had she been allowed to grieve and then govern, we cannot know. History was not particularly interested in finding out. The crown, in her case, was not a target. It was a cage. The Dowager Queen occupied her own particular kind of limbo. When a king died and left behind a widow, a woman who had been queen, who had built her household and her networks and raised her children at court, the question of what to do with her was not simple. There was not in most courts room for 2 queens. And so the Dowager moved to the margins, still technically honoured, still technically attached to her former status by title and precedence, but no longer at the centre. The income was often reduced. The household was scaled back. The properties assigned to her were rarely the finest ones. She was kept at a careful distance from the new court, close enough to access if politically useful, far enough to prevent her from becoming a gathering point for opposition. There is a word the diplomatic dispatches of this era use when they note the passing of a former queen. The word is quietly. She died quietly, as though quiet were a virtue she had finally, after everything achieved. The road to quiet was long, and it was rarely comfortable. That, then, is the full shape of it. The contracts and the portraits and the border ceremony and the bedding and the chamber and the court and the factions and the fabricated charges and the annulments and the convents and the slow isolation. This is what royal marriage actually was for the women who entered it. And yet, and this is the part I want you to stay with me for just a little longer. There were women who looked at this system and found their way through it, not around it, not by luck or by exemption, through it. Women who understood the machinery so thoroughly that they found ways to turn parts of it toward their own purposes. Women who were extraordinary not despite the constraints they lived under, but in full and clear-eyed understanding of them. I want to tell you about those women now. Eleanor of Aquitaine is the place to start, because Eleanor of Aquitaine is always the place to start when you're looking for evidence that the system could be outmaneuvered by the right person. She was born around 1122 in Aquitaine, a region of what is now southwestern France, one of the wealthiest and most culturally vibrant territories in Europe at the time. She inherited it at 15, when her father died without a male heir. The inheritance made her the most eligible woman in Europe overnight, and within weeks of her father's death, she was married to the future Louis VII of France, her lands absorbed into the French crown. She spent 15 years as Queen of France. She went on the Second Crusade, not as a camp follower, not as a passive observer, but as a participant who brought her own vassals and her own resources. This was extraordinary. It was also, in the opinion of Louis VII and most of the crusading leadership, deeply inconvenient. She had opinions about military strategy. She expressed them. She was not, in the formal diplomatic language of the era, easily managed. The marriage was annulled in 1152. Eleanor walked away from it with her lands. Within 2 months she had married Henry of Anjou. Henry became Henry II of England 2 years later. Eleanor was now Queen of England. She had 2 kingdoms' worth of political capital, and she intended to use it. She participated actively in governance. She administered her own lands in Aquitaine. She was, by the standards of her era, functioning more like a co-ruler than a queen consort. Henry II eventually had her imprisoned. In 1173 she supported a rebellion by her sons against their father, a rebellion that failed. Henry placed her in comfortable but real captivity, where she remained for 16 years. 16 years! She was in her 50s when she was imprisoned. She was in her late 60s when Henry II died, and her son Richard I, the Lionheart, came to the throne and released her. She was 67 years old. She had been imprisoned for 16 years. And what did she do? She governed England as regent while Richard went on crusade. She travelled to Germany to negotiate the payment of his ransom when he was captured. She crossed the Alps in winter, in her late 60s, to collect a bride for Richard from Spain, Berengaria of Navarre, and personally escorted her across the Mediterranean. She outlived 2 of her children who were kings. She outlived Henry II. She outlived Richard. She died in 1204 at approximately 80 years old in Fontevraud Abbey, having chosen, at last, her own retirement. Think about what it takes to be imprisoned at 50, released at 67, and then immediately start running a kingdom. That is not resilience in any ordinary sense. That is something that doesn't have a straightforward name. Isabella of Castile is the other name that belongs in this conversation. She came to the throne of Castile in 1474 under circumstances that were, to put it gently, disputed. There were other claimants. There was a war. She fought it, with Ferdinand of Aragon beside her. And this is the thing about Isabella that separates her from almost every other royal woman of her era. She chose her own husband. She negotiated the terms of her marriage before she agreed to it. The contract she drew up with Ferdinand stipulated that they would rule jointly, that decisions of governance would require both their agreement, that her rights to Castile would not be subordinate to his, that she would remain queen in her own name. This was, in the political language of 15th century Europe, essentially unprecedented. Queens consort did not negotiate equal partnership contracts. They accepted the terms they were given. Isabella did not accept the terms she was given. She and Ferdinand unified Spain. They sponsored the voyages of Columbus. They completed the Reconquista. They established the Spanish Inquisition, which is a legacy that is considerably more complicated and considerably darker than the rest of it. She was a woman of deep conviction and real ruthlessness. She was also, in the context of everything we've discussed tonight, a woman who had looked at the machinery of royal marriage and done something no one else had quite managed to do. She had used it as a foundation, not a ceiling. She died in 1504. Ferdinand remarried within the year. The woman he chose was young, French, and reportedly not particularly suited to him. He was, historians suggest, trying to produce a male heir who would inherit his kingdoms of Aragon and prevent them from passing to Joanna, his daughter, Isabella's daughter, the one who would end up imprisoned for 47 years. The irony is specific and very dark. The greatest queen of her generation, who had fought so hard to govern on her own terms, had a daughter who was imprisoned by her own son for the crime of being an inconvenient woman. The system was not defeated by Eleanor or Isabella. It was survived. It was navigated. It was, in their hands, bent significantly out of its intended shape. But it persisted. It closed around the women who came after them, as it had around all the women who came before. And then there is Blanche of Castile, who governed France twice as regent, once when her husband died and left her with a young son, Louis IX, to raise and a kingdom to run, and once when Louis went on crusade and left her, again, in charge. She was described by contemporaries as ruling more like a king than a queen. This was meant as a compliment. It tells you everything. She built the political alliances that kept Louis's reign stable. She maintained the royal finances with a precision that her husband had not matched. She suppressed baronial revolts. She educated her son with the values that would later make him, in the Church's estimation, a saint. She did all of this while holding no formal title of authority beyond her relationship to the men in her family. She did it anyway. There are letters she wrote to Louis while he was on crusade, motherly letters, political letters. The distinction between the two in her correspondence is very small. She missed him. She needed him to know what was happening at home. She needed him to trust her decisions. She was managing a kingdom and worrying about her son simultaneously, in the way that mothers always have, in the way that feels entirely ordinary until you remember the scale of what she was managing. The letters still exist. You can read them. They are in a hand that was careful and precise, the hand of a woman who knew her words might travel for weeks before they arrived, and who chose each one with the awareness that every sentence was also a document. She died in 1252, still working. There was no retirement for Blanche of Castile. There was governance, and then there was death, which is, in its own way, a kind of victory. These women, Eleanor, Isabella, Blanche, are not exceptions that disprove the pattern. They are evidence of what was possible within the pattern when the right person encountered the right circumstances with the right degree of refusal to accept the system's conclusions about her capabilities. They are in that sense more remarkable than the system's victories, because the system's victories were built into the design. These women were not. What the official portraits show us is always the public version. The commissioned image, the diplomatic document in oils, the woman in formal dress, in formal pose, with formal expression, composed, serene, entirely in command of the moment. Portraits were not made to reveal. They were made to communicate. They told the viewer what the subject's household wanted the viewer to know, which was always something carefully chosen. Anne Boleyn's portraits show a woman of striking self-possession, dark eyes, direct gaze, the expression of someone who's decided very deliberately how she wants to be seen. She sits or stands with the particular stillness of someone managing an enormous amount and making it look effortless. She does not look frightened. She never looks frightened in any surviving image. This was part of the performance, a performance she had been preparing in various forms for most of her adult life. What the portraits cannot show is the private version. The woman who lay awake in the early hours of the morning listening to the sounds of the palace she might not be in much longer. The woman who had read enough history to know what the signs meant, and who was reading them now, and whose face in those private hours looked nothing like the portrait. Anne Boleyn wrote a letter from the Tower of London, where she was held in the weeks before her execution. The letter most historians believe is genuine, written to Henry VIII, begins by saying that his displeasure and her imprisonment were things so strange to her that she did not know what to write or how to excuse herself. She goes on to protest her innocence. She asks that the accusations against her be properly examined. She writes with the precision of someone who knew this might be her last real communication to the person who held her life. The letter is remarkable, not because it is eloquent, though it is, but because of what it reveals about what she understood. She understood the game was over. She understood that protest was unlikely to help, and she wrote anyway, carefully, in her best hand, because she was someone who had always fought for herself. She was not going to stop because the circumstances had become impossible. She was executed 3 weeks later. The private letters of royal women form a kind of alternative history. a counter-narrative that runs alongside the official diplomatic record, written in a different register, preoccupied with different things. Catherine of Aragon's letters to her father, written during the years of limbo after Arthur's death, speak of financial worry, of the difficulty of maintaining her household, of her faith sustaining her through uncertainty. They are the letters of someone managing a very difficult situation with very limited resources and a great deal of quiet dignity. They are not the letters of a queen. They are the letters of a person, which is perhaps more interesting. Mary, Queen of Scots, wrote a letter to her son James VI the night before her execution in 1587. James was 21. He was King of Scotland in his own right, had been king since he was 13 months old, after Mary had been forced to abdicate in his favour. Mother and son had not met since he was an infant. The letter she wrote asked him to be just, to remember she had died for her faith, to remember her as his mother, even though he had no real memory of her as anything. He received the letter. He did not publicly mourn her execution. He was in the middle of delicate negotiations with Elizabeth I of England, who had ordered his mother's death. He had a kingdom to run and an English succession to secure. Grief, as we have noted, has a time limit built into it for those with crowns to manage. The letter still exists. Mary's handwriting toward the end becomes less controlled than the beginning. She'd been awake all night, it is believed, and was tired, and her hand was perhaps not entirely steady. But the words are clear. They are careful. They are the words of a woman who had been imprisoned for 19 years and who knew she would not be writing another letter after this one. She was 44 years old. There is a quality you notice when you read enough of the private correspondence of royal women from this era. They are precise. They are controlled. They do not, in general, allow themselves the emotional directness that might be read as weakness. But in the small things, the asking after the garden, the inquiring about a servant's health, the noting that the weather is cold and they miss the warmth of home, something else surfaces, a kind of transparency that the diplomatic record never shows, a kind of humanness that was not officially part of the job. They were not performing in their private letters. They were, in those moments, simply themselves, intelligent women, capable women, women who understood politics and precedent and the subtle mechanics of power, and also women who were cold, or homesick, or frightened, or missing someone, or finding the loneliness of their position difficult to bear on this particular evening. The two things are not contradictory. Eleanor of Aquitaine, crossing the Alps at 68 to secure a bride for her son, was also a woman who had spent 16 years imprisoned, and who knew what it was to have the hours stretch long and empty. Isabella of Castile, negotiating the terms of her marriage with diplomatic precision, was also a woman who fell genuinely in love with Ferdinand, and who wrote to him in the early years with a warmth that has nothing diplomatic about it. Blanche of Castile managed a kingdom. She also wrote to her son on crusade and asked him to eat properly. The King of France, the future saint, needed to eat properly. His mother was worried. That detail stays with me. You tend to think of these women one at a time: Eleanor, Catherine, Anne, Mary, Isabella, Blanche, Joanna. The names that survive the centuries, the names attached to portraits that hang in galleries, the names in the history books. But for every woman whose name survived, whose letters were preserved, whose story was told, there were dozens whose names did not. The second daughters of minor lords, the brides sent to smaller courts, to provincial kingdoms, to arrangements that were diplomatically significant but not historically famous. The women whose letters were lost, whose portraits were not commissioned, whose graves are unmarked. They went through the same machinery. They crossed the same kind of border. They lay in the same kind of sealed chamber. They navigated the same kind of court. They wrote letters home that may or may not have survived, asking about the garden, asking whether the roses bloomed. We don't know their names. That is, in its own way, part of the story too. History is very good at preserving the names of the powerful. It is considerably less reliable about preserving the names of the women who were adjacent to the powerful. The queen whose story is famous was famous in part because her husband was famous enough for his records to survive. The queen whose story is lost was lost for the same reason. Her husband's records did not survive, and his records were the ones that mentioned her. She existed. She crossed the border. She walked forward. There is something about sitting with that knowledge, about holding the fact of all those unnamed women alongside the named ones, that changes the way the famous stories feel. They are not exceptions. They are the visible part of something much larger and much quieter. Every Eleanor is surrounded by hundreds of women whose names we do not have, who made the same journey, who bore the same losses, who signed letters we will never read with names that did not make it through. The fire crackles somewhere in the distance. The stone is cold. The candles are burning lower. Let the room get quieter around you if it can, because there is more to say, not about the facts, not about the battles and the contracts and the betrayals, but about what all of it means when you step back far enough to see the shape of it, when you let the details recede and look at the thing as a whole. What you see when you do that is not a story about women who suffered. It is a story about what people can do within systems that were not designed for them, about the forms that dignity and intelligence and love can take when they have very little room to operate. It is, in the end, a story about survival, not dramatic survival, not the kind that gets commemorated, the quiet, daily, unremarkable kind, the survival of getting through another morning and attending to what the morning required, even when the morning required things that no one should be asked to bear. That kind of survival is not famous. It rarely makes it into the portraits, but it was there, in every court, in every sealed chamber, in every letter written by a hand that had been awake all night, in every carriage rolling through a foreign country in the dark. It was there. Let me bring you back to the carriage. Not because we haven't left it. We have, in every sense. We have been to the courts of France and England and Spain and Scotland. We have been to the Tower and to Tordesillas and to Kimbleton and to Fontevraud Abbey and to the sealed birthing chambers of a dozen forgotten palaces. We have been to the border ceremony, to the bedding, to the morning after inspection. We have been to the scaffold, but the carriage is still there. It has always been there, underneath all of it. The 3 weeks of rolling road, the girl of 14, the aching back, the cushions that stopped helping, the outside world sliding past the window in a language that is not yet hers. I want to go back to her for a moment, not to examine her, not to analyze what the machinery has made of her or what it will make of her, just to sit with her, briefly, in the dark of the carriage. In the last hour before she arrives, she's looking out the window. The landscape is different from home. The shapes of the hills are different. The trees are different varieties. The farmhouses are built in a way she's never seen before. She's been noting these differences for 3 weeks, cataloguing them, the way the mind does when it is trying to build a map of an unfamiliar world. She has been constructing piece by piece the shape of the place that will now be her life. She's doing this automatically without being asked to, because she's intelligent, and intelligent people do not stop trying to understand what is around them, even in a carriage in the dark heading towards something they cannot see clearly, especially then. Her back aches. She is tired in a way that sleep doesn't entirely fix, the travelling kind of tired, the kind that lives in the joints and the muscles and won't resolve until you've been still for several days in the same place. She's been still only at night, and the nights have been different beds, different rooms, different sounds. She's thinking about home. She's thinking about her mother. She's thinking about something specific, probably not home as an abstract concept, but a particular thing. The way the morning light came through the window of a specific room, the sound of a particular voice, the smell of something she associates with safety and familiarity, and the version of herself that existed before this journey began. She's 14 years old. She's about to be someone's wife. She's about to be a queen. She does not know, sitting in that carriage, what the next years will hold. How many pregnancies, how many losses, how many mornings in a sealed chamber, how many letters written in a hand that has stayed careful even when nothing else has. She does not know which of the women assembled to receive her at the end of this road will become someone she can trust, and which of them will report what she says to someone she will never meet. She does not know whether the man at the end of this road will be kind to her, or whether kindness will be relevant, or whether the question of kindness is even quite the right one to be asking about the situation she's entering. She knows the contract. She knows the terms. She knows the language she's expected to speak, and the religion she's expected to practice, and the children she's expected to produce. She has been educated carefully in all of this. She knows the shape of the life she's entering. What no one has been able to tell her, what no education in any court could have provided, is what it will feel like from the inside. What the days will actually be like, one after another, in a place that is not home, with people who are not family, carrying the weight of an alliance in her body and her behaviour and her every public word. That is the thing the portraits never captured. That is the thing the diplomatic dispatches never mentioned. That is the thing that lives in the letters, in the fragments, in the asking after the garden and the inquiring about the dog and the note that the weather here is cold. The carriage slows, the road narrows. The lights of the city are visible now through the window, torches, lanterns, the flickering warm light of a place that has been preparing for her arrival. The crowds will be there, the banners, the formal reception. The man she's going to marry standing somewhere in that lit-up city waiting. She straightens. She composes her face. She is for the next several hours not the girl who's been travelling for 3 weeks. She is the symbol, the alliance, the future queen. She's very good at this already. She's been practicing for years. The carriage stops. There is a particular quality to the night air when a long journey ends. It is colder than the air inside the carriage, fresher, with the smell of torches and horses and the particular smell of a city that is not your city. Someone opens the door. Someone offers a hand. The lights are very bright after the darkness of the carriage. She steps down. She smiles. History is full of moments like this. Moments where the private version and the public version have to meet, where the girl who has been in the carriage for 3 weeks has to become, in an instant, the queen who has arrived. Where the tiredness and the aching back and the homesickness and the private fear have to be folded away quickly, competently, into whatever part of herself she keeps things that aren't permitted to be visible. Every royal woman we have spoken about tonight did this. Every one of them, at some point performed this particular transformation, took the private, complicated human version of herself and replaced it, for the audience, with the composed and purposeful public version. The performance was not dishonesty exactly. It was the job. It was what the role required. And most of them did it for decades, in public, without complaint, without acknowledgement that it was effortful. We look at the portraits and we see the composed, purposeful public version. We read the diplomatic dispatches and we see the political function. What we have to work harder to see, what requires the letters, the fragments, the small surviving details, is the private version that was doing the work underneath. She asked about the roses. She asked whether they had bloomed. She was not asking because she had forgotten for a moment that she was a queen. She was asking because she was a person who remembered the garden, and remembering the garden was one of the things that kept the private version of herself intact. A small piece of home, preserved in a letter, sent across hundreds of miles, probably arriving weeks after she'd sent it to a mother who may or may not have written back before circumstances changed. These small pieces were what they had. They carried them carefully. They asked about the roses. Let those details settle around you now. Let them be the last things that stay with you before everything else gets quieter. You have been on a long journey tonight. You know things now that most people who glance at the portraits don't know. You know what was behind the composed expression. You know what was in the sealed chamber. You know what was in the letters. You know about the girl in the carriage. The room around you is very quiet. Your own body is settling into stillness. The things that needed to wait until tomorrow are still waiting. They'll be there when the morning comes. For now, there is just this. There is something else that most histories skip past. The ordinary days. Not the wedding days and the execution days and the days of political crisis. Not the days that made it into the diplomatic dispatches and the chronicle entries and the letters of ambassadors to their home courts. The ordinary days. The days when the crisis had not yet arrived, or had recently passed, or was still gathering somewhere out of sight. The days that made up most of a life, even a royal one, especially a royal one. What did those days look like? You wake early. This is not optional. The schedule of a royal household runs on a precision that would surprise most people who romanticize the era. There are prayers to attend, in the Queen's private chapel, or in the main chapel of the palace, or wherever the current residence is situated. Morning prayers are not brief. They are a fixed and substantial part of the day's structure, and attendance is expected. You attend, you pray, or you observe the form of prayer while your mind moves over the business of the day. You've been doing this since childhood. The form of it is familiar even when the content of the prayers is very far from peaceful. After the chapel, there is the matter of getting dressed. This takes a long time. It takes a long time because the clothing of a queen consort in the medieval and early modern world is not clothing in any simple sense. It is architecture. The layers, the construction, the precision required to assemble it correctly. Petticoats and stomachers and sleeves that had to be pinned on. Ruffs that had to be set and stiffened. Jewels that had to be selected, each choice carrying its own message to whoever might see them and understand the language of such things, which at court was essentially everyone. The women who dressed you moved quickly and quietly. They had done this hundreds of times. They knew the order. They knew which pieces came first and which came last, and how to handle the pins and the hooks and the complicated fastenings without catching the fabric or drawing blood. You stood, and they assembled you around your standing, and when it was done, when all the layers were in the correct places and the jewels were fastened and the hair was arranged, You looked like a queen. You looked, more precisely, like the version of a queen that this particular morning required you to be. The mornings had a rhythm. The afternoons had a different rhythm. Audiences and petitions and correspondence. The correspondence alone was a substantial occupation. Queens were expected to write and to receive and to be literate in the political meaning of what was written to them and in what they wrote in return. Many of them were exceptional correspondents. They had been educated for this, as they had been educated for everything else that the role required. Catherine of Aragon was said to have been one of the finest Latin scholars at the English court. She had been educated by her mother, Isabella of Castile, in the humanist tradition. She read classical authors. She corresponded with Erasmus. She was, by the intellectual standards of her era, genuinely impressive. Anne Boleyn had been educated at the French court, which in the early 16th century was one of the centres of Renaissance learning. She read French and could speak it fluently. She was interested in religious reform, and her library, in the years before everything else became more pressing, was substantial. These women were not the passive recipients of a decorative education. They were trained rigorously for a role that required genuine capability across a wide range of disciplines: languages, music, dancing, the management of a complex household, the navigation of political relationships, the maintenance of correspondence, the oversight of their own estates and finances where they had any. The education was, in part, an education in compliance, but it was also an education in competence, and competence once installed does not stay where you put it. The embroidery rooms. There is a version of history where royal women are always in the embroidery room, always engaged in the gentlest and most domestic of occupations while the men conduct the real business outside the door. And while it is true that embroidery was a constant and substantial occupation, queens embroidered, produced needlework, made gifts of worked fabric, it is also true that the embroidery room was a political space. The women who sat together and worked were talking. They were exchanging information. They were managing relationships, resolving disputes, consolidating influence. The needles moved. The conversation moved faster. Mary Queen of Scots embroidered in captivity. She was held under varying degrees of house arrest in England for 19 years, from 1568 to 1587, and during that time she produced an extraordinary body of needlework, some of it documentary, some of it coded, some of it simply the occupation of an intelligent woman who needed to do something with her hands while her situation was beyond her control. Several pieces survive. They include, among other things, a series of small embroidered panels featuring animals with recognizable allegorical meaning. A cat and a mouse, for instance, which has been interpreted as a commentary on her relationship with Elizabeth I. Whether Mary intended the specific reading, or whether it is the interpretation of the later historians, is not certain. But Mary was a woman who paid attention to detail and who understood the language of symbols. The interpretation is not implausible. The evenings in a royal palace had their own particular character. The light changed, the candles were lit, the fires built up, the colours of the rooms shifted from the cool grey-white of daylight to the warm amber of candlelight. The shadows were different. The sounds were different. Music, often. Most royal households maintained musicians, and music was a constant presence in the evening hours. Dancing, at the more active courts. Conversation, always. The Queen would receive visitors, or she would visit others, or she would take her supper in a formal setting with a formal structure that everyone present understood. The hierarchy of the seating arrangement communicated volumes to anyone who knew how to read it, and at court everyone knew how to read it. Later, much later, when the formal obligations of the evening were concluded, there was the retreat to the private chambers, the undressing, the reverse of the morning's process, the same women in the same order, the layers removed and folded and put away, the face washed, the hair unpinned, the complicated, assembled public version of herself taken apart and set aside for mourning. And then the bed, the private version of herself restored. The thoughts that had been deferred all day, that had been moving in the background while the audience was in session and the correspondence was being managed, and the supper was being eaten and the music was playing. Those thoughts came forward now. They had been waiting patiently. They were allowed their time. What did those thoughts contain? We cannot know precisely. Thoughts leave no record unless someone writes them down, and the private thoughts of royal women were not in general written down, or if they were written down in documents that are now lost, or that were deliberately destroyed. Diary keeping as a personal practice was not yet widespread in the way it would become later. The inner life was private in a very complete sense, but we can make some reasonable inferences. We know from the letters what the preoccupations were. The children, always their health, their education, their futures, their safety. The letters from any royal mother who was separated from her children, and many were, are saturated with this preoccupation. Not performed concern, not diplomatic courtesy, actual worry, the kind that sits in the chest in the dark hours. Catherine of Aragon's daughter, Mary, was taken from her mother's household in 1533, when Henry VIII declared Catherine's marriage null and Mary illegitimate. Mary was 17 years old. She was ordered to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her infant half-sister Elizabeth, which was a deliberate humiliation. Catherine and Mary were not permitted to meet, though they were sometimes in the same vicinity. Catherine wrote to Mary. The letters had to pass through channels that were not reliable. She told Mary to be obedient. She told her to take care of her health. She told her she was loved. They did not see each other again before Catherine died in 1536. Mary was 20 years old when her mother died. She was alone in England in a court that had spent years actively hostile to her. Her faith sustained her, as her mother's faith had sustained Catherine. She became queen in 1553, the first queen regnant of England, and she ruled for 5 years before dying in 1558 at 42, of what is believed to have been uterine or ovarian cancer, one final reproductive tragedy in a family that seemed to attract them. Her reign was marked by the persecution of Protestants, for which she has been called Bloody Mary in the centuries since, a title that says as much about the winners of the subsequent religious wars as it does about her. Whether she was monstrous, or simply a woman of her convictions ruling in a dangerous moment, is a question historians continue to discuss. What is less debated is that she was shaped, profoundly, by a childhood of loss and isolation that would have broken most people. That she emerged from it capable of ruling at all is itself a kind of testament. The thoughts, then, in the dark hours of the private chamber, the children, the letters, the relationships that were conducting themselves across hundreds of miles, through couriers who could not be entirely trusted, in words that had to be carefully chosen. The business of the following day, which was already taking shape in the back of the mind. The faith, which was for many of these women not a performance, but a genuine comfort, a conversation with something that was not political, not transactional, not watching her for signs of vulnerability. And underneath all of it, often, the body's own preoccupations, the pregnancy that was advancing, the recovery from the one that had ended badly, the particular exhaustion that accumulates over years of managing a public life while maintaining a private one, the ache in the back from a day of formal dress, the weight of the jewels now removed that had left small marks on the skin. The candle burned down, the fire settled. The sounds of the palace after midnight was different from the sounds of the palace at any other hour. Quieter, slower, the rhythms of a place resting, the guard's footsteps, the distant sound of water somewhere. A dog that had not yet been settled for the night. She lay in the dark. She thought her thoughts. She perhaps allowed herself the very small luxury of being homesick for a moment, of letting the image of the garden, the sound of the familiar bell, the smell of the specific room in the specific house she had grown up in, come forward without immediately being set aside, of letting herself miss, for a moment, the person she had been before the carriage. And then she composed herself. She prepared for sleep. She would need the morning. The morning was always coming. The morning always required her. Sleep in these palaces was not always easy to find. The palaces themselves were not quiet places. They were, even in their stillest hours, full of the sounds that large buildings make, the settling of stone walls, the movement of guards on their rounds, the distant bark of a dog in the courtyard, the sound of wind finding its way through shutters that were not quite flush with their frames. The fires burned through the night in the larger rooms, but died down in the smaller ones, and the cold that followed the dying fire had its own particular quality, a creeping cold, working its way in from the walls and the floor, patient and methodical. She slept in layers, layers of blankets, layers of clothing, the feather beds that the wealthiest households could provide, and that absorbed the body's warmth slowly, over the first hour, becoming gradually, almost imperceptibly, more bearable. The room, by midnight, would have settled into something that was not quite comfortable, but was close enough. The fire a collection of embers now, the candles out, the darkness very complete. Medieval and early modern darkness is something worth pausing over. We have forgotten it so thoroughly that it requires an effort of imagination to reconstruct. Darkness now is never quite total. There is always some light source somewhere, the glow of a phone, the edge of a street lamp under a curtain, the faint luminescence of digital things. The darkness of a palace in the 14th century was not like that. It was an absolute. The only light was what you made, and when you stopped making it, there was none. She lay in that absolute dark. Above her she could not see the ceiling of the room she was in, but she knew its shape. The carved beams, or the plaster, or the stone vaulting depending on the palace and the century and the particular room she occupied. She had looked at it in daylight. She had mapped it, the way the mind maps the spaces it inhabits. She knew the distance from the bed to the door. She knew where the window was, and which way the faint grey of pre-dawn light would appear when it finally came. She was waiting, with the patience of someone who had learned to wait for the morning. The night had its own sounds, underneath the building's sounds, the sound of her own breathing slowing. The sound of whoever shared her chamber. Ladies in waiting often slept in the Queen's room, or in an adjacent antechamber, shifting in their own sleep or lying as still as she was lying as awake. The sound of her own heart felt more than heard, steady and untroubled and entirely uninterested in the political situation she was managing. The body has its own concerns. It keeps itself going through everything else. It breathes and beats and performs its various necessities with a kind of indifference to circumstance that is, when you notice it, rather reassuring. All the queens we have spoken about tonight, Catherine, Anne, Jane, Mary, Eleanor, Isabella, Blanche, Joanna, all of them had bodies that woke them and fed them and carried them through the days, that ached when tired and warmed when held, and felt the cold the same as anyone. The machinery of biology, running underneath the machinery of politics, as reliable as either was unreliable. The body sleeps, or tries to, or lies quietly in the dark and rests, which is the closest available approximation when sleep itself will not come. There is a quality to lying quietly in the dark that is its own kind of rest. The thoughts slow. They don't stop. They rarely stop entirely. But they slow. They become less urgent. The problem that seemed enormous at the end of the evening is still there, but it has lost some of its sharp edges in the dark. It is still a problem. It will still be a problem in the morning. But the morning is not now. Now is this. The dark and the breathing and the slow weight of the blankets. This is where you are now, in a sense, not in a palace, in your own room, in your own bed, in your own dark. The things that needed to wait until tomorrow are still waiting. They are patient in the way that the night is patient. They will be there when you need them. But you don't need them yet. The candles have been out for a long time. The fire is down to its last quiet warmth. The room around you has settled into the particular stillness that a room only achieves when everything in it has stopped trying to be anything other than what it is. You have been on a long journey tonight. You have been to places that no longer exist, in years that have accumulated into centuries, and you have sat with people whose names the history books know, and people whose names they don't, and you have held, for a while, the shape of their lives, the contracts and the portraits and the border ceremony, the sealed room and the morning inspection, the court and the factions and the letters, the roses in the garden that she missed and asked about. Those things are still there somewhere behind you. They don't require anything more from you tonight. The Queen slept, even Catherine, even in those last years at Kimbolton, with the cold coming in and the household reduced and the letters taking weeks to arrive. Even she slept. The body insists on it. The body knows that tomorrow will require her, and that tomorrow cannot be met without rest, and so it reaches for rest with the same practical patience it applies to everything else. The night in these old palaces stretched long and dark and quiet. The guards walked their circuits outside. The dogs settled in the courtyards. The fires died down to orange and then to red and then to the faint heat of ash. The stone walls held the cold as stone walls do, indifferent and permanent. Inside the chamber the breathing slowed. The embroidery was set aside. The letters were folded and sealed or half written or waiting to be read. The jewels were in their box. The complicated assembled version of herself was put away until morning. What remained in the dark and the silence was simply the person, the tired person, the person who had been 14 in a carriage 3 weeks ago and was now whoever she'd become since, with all the gains and losses of that becoming. She was there. She was present in her own life, in the darkness of her own room, in the particular quiet of a night that was hers and no one else's. Not the Queen, not the symbol, not the diplomatic function, not the political liability or the political asset, just the person in the dark, breathing slowly, waiting for sleep. There is a kind of peace in that, not the peace of everything being resolved. Nothing was resolved, not for most of them, not for a long time, and some things were never resolved at all. but the peace of the night itself, which does not require resolution, which asks only that you be still for a little while, which offers to anyone who will accept it the mercy of sleep. Eleanor of Aquitaine, at 67, released from 16 years of imprisonment, governing England as regent, she slept. She had to. She had too much to do in the morning not to. Isabella of Castile, in the middle of a war for her crown, in the middle of a reformation of a kingdom, in the middle of a marriage that was its own complicated negotiation, she slept. Blanche of Castile, with France on her shoulders and a son on crusade, and the baronial factions perpetually looking for an opening, she slept. They woke up and did the work, and then they slept again. This is what survival looks like from the inside. Not dramatic, not commemorated, just the quiet cycling of days and nights, the work and the rest and the work again, the letters written and the prayers said and the embroidery completed, and the morning attended and the evening survived, and the dark when it came accepted. The dark when it came accepted. Let yours settle around you now. It is already here. The room is quiet. The things that will need you tomorrow are still being patient. Your body knows what to do. It has been doing it all your life through everything else, with the same reliable indifference to circumstance that all bodies share. The breathing slows, the thoughts thin out, the edges of everything soften just slightly. This is sleep coming. It always comes in the end for the queens and for the girls in the carriages, and for the women in the sealed chambers, and for the women writing letters in the small hours about roses they are missing. It comes for everyone who is tired enough and still enough to let it arrive. You're tired enough. You have been on a long journey. Let it come. The palace at night has a particular smell. It is not unpleasant exactly, but it is specific. The kind of smell that only accumulates over centuries of inhabitation. Stone and mortar, the particular mineral coolness of thick walls that have absorbed the cold of many winters. Beeswax from the candles that burned all evening. The faint trace of wood smoke from the fires now reduced to coals. The smell of the rushes on the floor in the earlier centuries, dried herbs mixed in, lavender or rosemary or meadowsweet, releasing their last traces of scent as the night deepened. Later, in the grander palaces, tapestries and woven carpets that held their own particular archive of warmth and dust and the accumulated years. The smell of a very old building in the deep of night is the smell of time made physical, of all the people who slept in these rooms before, of all the mornings they woke to, and all the evenings they put behind them. The palace holds it all, in a way that stone is very good at holding things, quietly, without comment, with the particular patience of something that will still be there long after everyone who is currently using it has moved on. She was one of them, one in a long chain of women who had occupied this room, or rooms like it, in this palace or palaces like it, who had lain in this dark and breathed this air and waited for the morning with whatever degree of peace or anxiety the current circumstances permitted. She was temporary in the palace's long view. They all were. There is something settling about that thought, rather than diminishing. The palace has seen everything. It has seen the weddings and the births and the deaths and the trials and the betrayals and the quiet ordinary days and the letters written at midnight and the prayers said in the small hours and the tears that nobody saw. It holds all of it, in its stones and its walls and its deep old quiet, and it is still there, and the night is still the same night it has always been. And the dark is still dark, and the breathing is still slow, and the morning is still coming as it always has, regardless of everything. The things that happened in these rooms, the things we've spoken about tonight, happened long ago. They are past. They are settled. They are in the record now, or some of them are, and they will remain in the record, and the women who lived them have been resting for centuries. Not in the way they hoped, perhaps. Most of them hoped for something different, for the usual human things. More time, more peace, more of the good parts and less of the difficult ones. But they are resting now, in whatever form that takes across the span of centuries. Their stories are still here. The letters are still here. The embroidery is still here. The portraits are still here, with their composed expressions and their careful jewels and their direct measuring gazes. They look out from the portraits with the patience of people who have been waiting and are still waiting to be understood. You understand a little more tonight than you did when this evening began. The room around you is very quiet. There is nothing that needs your attention right now. The day has been whatever the day was, something you carried, something you managed, something you moved through. And now it is behind you, and the night is here, and the night's only real request is this: rest. The body knows how to do this. It has always known. The breath slows, the muscles ease their grip on the bones, the thoughts that seemed sharp an hour ago have gone soft at the edges. The distance between here and sleep is measured not in effort, but in the simple willingness to stop trying. You don't have to try anymore. The morning will come as it always does, patient and inevitable, and entirely indifferent whether you are ready for it or not. The queens woke to their mornings. The girls in the carriages arrived at the ends of their roads. The women in the sealed chambers emerged from them, one way or another, into whatever came next. History moved, the centuries accumulated, and all the ordinary days, the prayers and the dressing and the embroidery and the letters and the evenings and the long, slow dark of the nights, all of those days added up to lives, to real lives, to lives that were genuinely extraordinary in their difficulty and their endurance and their occasional hard-won grace. You know that now. You have held it tonight, and tomorrow, when the morning comes, some small part of that knowing will still be there. Not the specifics necessarily, not the dates and the names and the details, but something underneath the specifics, something about what it means to keep going day after day, through things that are difficult and things that are uncertain and things that require more of you than seems quite fair. Something about the ordinary persistence of people who have very little choice about the circumstances they are navigating, who navigate them anyway, with whatever resources are available. Catherine found her faith. Eleanor found her determination. Isabella found her kingdom. Blanche found her son. Mary found her roses, or she didn't find them. She asked about them, and the asking was its own answer, its own small act of remaining herself in circumstances that were trying to remake her into something else. That detail is still here. It always will be. The fire is down to its warmth now. The room is very still. Whatever sounds were moving through the night have found their way into the background, where they belong. The kind of sounds you stop hearing because they have become part of the silence. Your breath is slow. Your body is heavy in the good way, the way that means it is releasing the day and accepting the night. The thoughts are moving slowly, without urgency. Some of them have already gone ahead of you, into the soft and formless territory where sleep begins. You can follow them. There is nothing here that requires your attention. There is no letter to write and no audience to attend and no court to navigate and no border to cross. There is only this room, and this dark, and the long, slow breath, and the night that has settled in around you, like something that has always been here, Wait impatiently, as the night always does. Rest now. The palace is quiet. The candles are out. The fire is the softest orange in the corner of the room, barely enough to see by, just enough to know you're not alone in the dark, that the warmth is still there, steady and unhurried, not going anywhere. The stones hold the night. The walls hold the quiet. The centuries hold all the mornings that are already past, and you, in this room, in this moment, can simply let go of all of it for a little while. Sleep. There are stories that stay with you, not the dramatic ones necessarily, not the scaffold and the scaffold speech and the famous last words, not the armies and the alliances and the dates that historians argue about. The stories that stay are often the smaller ones, the ones that fit in a single sentence, or that don't fit in any sentence at all, that live instead in the space between sentences, in the implication, in the detail that is almost a footnote. The detail that stays with me, from everything we've covered tonight, is not a battle. It is not an execution. It is not even a birth or a death in the formal recorded sense. It is a letter about roses, a woman who had been sent from everything she knew to a place she was still learning. She had crossed a border and left behind the people who spoke her language and the room where the morning light came in a particular way. She was managing, with considerable skill and very little acknowledgement, the enormous difficulty of the position she found herself in. That woman sat down one evening and wrote to ask whether the roses had bloomed that summer. She could not be there for them. She had missed that summer and the summer before it, and would miss the ones to come. But she needed to know. She asked. The asking matters. The asking is the whole of it in some ways. The proof that underneath all the diplomacy and the performance and the careful management of a very public life, there was still this: a person who remembered a garden, a person who was homesick, a person who was tired and a little cold and missing something specific that could not be replaced or replicated in the foreign court she now inhabited. The candle on the table has burned to its last inch. The wax is pooled around the base, warm and soft, the flame very small now, barely enough to cast a shadow. In a few minutes it will be out entirely. The room will be darker. The dark will be complete. And that will be all right. The dark asks nothing of you that the light did. It simply holds you, quietly, in a different way. The room settles further. The sounds outside are very far away now. The particular weight of the night, the old, patient, unhurried weight of it, is something you can feel if you let yourself. It has been here before. It will be here again. It is here now. These women were that too, all of them. Whatever else they were, whatever the portraits show, whatever the diplomatic dispatches say, whatever the history books have made of them in the centuries since, they were that too. Tired and cold and homesick and asking about the garden, in their own ways, in their own private moments, in the letters and the prayers and the long quiet dark of the nights. There is comfort in that, I think, in the persistence of the human underneath the official, in the way that even the most circumscribed and observed and politically instrumentalized life still has, in it, a person who wants to know whether the roses bloomed. You are that too. Whatever your day was, whatever you're carrying into this night, there is still the person underneath it all, the tired person, the person who wants to know about the roses, the person who is lying in the dark now, in their own room, and who has been on a long journey tonight and is ready to rest. The mornings in those old palaces always came. They came regardless of what the night had held. They came for the women who had slept and for the women who had not. The light found its way under the shutters, or through the curtains, or over the sill of the window that looked east, and the room filled slowly with a grey, quiet light that was not yet day, but was no longer night. The birds began, somewhere in the gardens or the courtyard, with the specific insistence of birds who have no opinion about whether you are ready for morning. The fire, if it had survived, crackled with new fuel when the servants arrived to tend it. The Queen opened her eyes. The girl in the carriage arrived at the end of her road. The woman in the chamber rested in the days that followed. The woman in the castle at Tordesillas looked at the same courtyard she'd been looking at for 40 years and found, in the small movements of light and season, something to hold on to. They held on. They held on to whatever there was to hold on to. The faith, the children, the letters, the embroidery, the small beauty of a courtyard garden in a season that was not yet spring, the memory of roses that had bloomed in summers they had been present for and were not present for now. They held on. And tonight you have been present for their stories. You have held them briefly, the way you hold anything carried with care, gently, aware of the weight, aware of what it cost to get here. And now you can set them down, very gently, and let them rest in the place where all completed things rest. The night is quiet, the room is still, the breath is slow, the thoughts have gone very soft and very distant. Sleep. History with Sikandar. Thanks you for being here tonight, for choosing to spend your evening hours in the company of people who lived a long time ago and left behind enough of themselves, in letters and in portraits and in the small surviving details, that we can still, if we sit quietly with them, feel something of what they felt. They would not have imagined this. A voice telling their stories to someone lying in the dark, in a world they could not have pictured, in a time that is as distant from their own as theirs was from the Romans. They would not have imagined it. But I think they would have been glad of it. Rest now. The stories are told. The candles are out. The fire is the softest warmth. The night is doing what nights do, holding you, quietly, in the dark. Good night. But before the morning, and there is always a morning, there is this, the last stretch of the night, the hour that exists between the deep dark and the first grey, the hour when the palace is at its quietest. The guards on their rounds have found their rhythm, and it has become something close to automatic. The dogs in the courtyard have long since settled. The last candle that anyone forgot to snuff has finally burned itself down to nothing. This is the hour that belongs to no one and everyone, to the Queen in her chamber, and the servant in the attic, and the guard at the gate, and the cook, who has already begun to stir in the kitchen far below, beginning the first preparations for the morning that is still an hour away. The same hour, shared without any of them knowing it, the same dark, the same quiet, the same breath of cold from the walls. She is still. The blankets have found their warmth by now. The body has done its work, easing out of the tension of the day and into something more forgiving. The thoughts, if there are any, are slow and formless. Images more than words, the particular quality of thought that belongs to the edge of sleep. The face in the candlelight of the audience chamber, the smell of the chapel in the morning, the sound of a particular voice that is far away and getting no closer, the memory of home, soft and inexact, the way memories get when time has worked on them. Not the specific house anymore exactly, but the feeling of it, the feeling of being in a place that knew you, the particular ease of being somewhere that did not require anything of you, the garden that did not need you to be anyone in particular, the roses. In the morning there will be correspondence to attend to, There will be the careful dress of the day and the careful management of the face that the day requires. There will be the audience and the appointment and the obligation and the political relationship that needs tending and the faction that needs watching. There will be all of it, waiting with the patience of everything that has no choice but to wait for morning. But that is morning, and morning is not yet here. Now there is only the dark and the breath and the deep, gradual easing of the body into its own weight, the letting go of the day's structure, the release of the public version of herself, which has done its work faithfully and now is permitted to rest. She is not a queen right now. She is not a symbol or a diplomatic function, or a political liability, or a political asset. She is not the portrait or the letter or the official account. She is the person, lying in the dark, breathing slowly, releasing the day. This is the truth of it. This is what history does not put in the records, because records are for the day and its events and its outcomes. The night escapes the record. The quiet escapes the record. The breathing escapes the record. The slow loosening of a tired person into rest, that escapes the record. It happened anyway. Every night, in every palace and every castle and every cold residence, and every chamber of every court that we have moved through tonight, the night came and the person rested or tried to rest, or lay quietly in the dark and let the day recede. It happened for Eleanor in her confinement, and for Catherine in her limbo, and for Mary in her tower. It happened for Blanche, with her kingdom on her shoulders. It happened for the girl in the carriage who had arrived tomorrow, and it happened for the girl who had already arrived, and was now lying in an unfamiliar bed, in an unfamiliar room, listening to unfamiliar sounds and waiting for them to become familiar. It happened for all of them. And it is happening for you now. The day is receding. The night is here. The room is quiet in the way that rooms get when they have accepted the night and settled into it, when the last of the day's energy has dissipated and what remains is simply the still, patient dark of a room at rest. Your own breath is slow. Your own body is finding its weight. The thoughts that were moving have slowed to something barely moving at all. Impressions, half-formed images, the soft dissolution of focus that is the beginning of sleep. Let it come. You've earned it. You've been on a long journey. The morning will come when the morning comes. The queens knew this. They woke to their mornings. They faced what their mornings held. They put one foot in front of the other through days that were difficult, and days that were ordinary, and days that were both at once. They asked about the roses. They kept going. You will too, tomorrow. But that is tomorrow. Tonight is this. The dark, the quiet, the slow, steady breath. Sleep well.